afternoon, Pradeep. Let me first welcome you to the Modern India and our frontrunner talk. My name is Thoralf Stenvold. I'm a Norwegian diplomat with 25 years experience from various countries and organizations, including India, where we met the first time, you and I, Pradeep, back in 2012. Before coming to India, I had served in China, at the World Trade Organization and at the United Nations. So with this background, I look very much forward to this conversation with you as one of the world's foremost experts on the global trading system in general and the World Trade Organization in particular. And as the WTO now turns 25 years old, we found for the modern India, it's a good occasion to address this organization, its background, its significance, and its future. So with that, Pradeep, I would first like you to explain to me the significance of the World Trade Organization as opposed to its predecessor, the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in general for the world, but in particular for India. What is the value of the World Trade Organization for India and other developing countries?
Thank you. Thank you. First of all, let me thank you for inviting me to speak to you about an issue which is very close to my heart. You may recall that as we stand today, the WTO appears to be in a limbo, particularly because of the non-functioning of its dispute settlement system. And therefore, there are efforts being made from all around to see that it is resuscitated. Now, why resuscitated? Because it has proved its merit over the last 25 years, as it were. Now, what its predecessor, the GATT, was a general agreement on tariffs and trade. What the WTO does is takes it a step beyond to institutionalize the framework agreements under the various trade agreements and to provide for an institutional regime which would include the organization of dispute settlement, as I said. I mean, it is the most critical. It is what has also been defined as the jewel in its crown, and also why it is also the victim of its own success. In the GATT, I mean, one basic difference for the laity, which I would like to say, is in the GATT, dispute panels were set up, but their decisions were not binding. What the WTO has done is to make the decisions of dispute panels binding. Now, in terms of its implications for the world and India as such, what it has helped is to bring forward to help countries to industrialize and be able to trade, which would also mean what the preamble of the WTO says is to raise the living standards of people, to create jobs. That even in India, what we've seen is over 400 million people have been lifted out of poverty ever since the WTO came into being. So it is an essential, I would say it is an imperative framework for governing international trade and trade relations between one and the other countries.
Right. Now, if it's such a wonderful thing as you describe, which I personally think I tend to agree with you that in the big picture for the world as a whole, and probably for most countries, if not all countries, at the macro level, more efficient allocation of resources, more predictability for trade and investment is definitely a good thing. So if that is the case, why are so many people around the world, and perhaps in some countries more than others, so critical of the World Trade Organization?
What has happened is, when you look at any liberalization efforts as against a centrally managed economy, the kind of Soviet model which existed, under which a very large number of developing countries also managed their own countries, the poverty was there. what has happened now is trade liberalization and concomitant economic liberalization has led to higher inequality in the sense that the rich are becoming richer and some of the poor, mind you, not all, are becoming poorer. Now, as a result of the globalization which is taking place, many people have lost jobs. There are winners and losers in any such kind of situation. Now, governments have not been able to take care of the losers for very obvious reasons. Either they did not have the resources, or the fact is that they thought that things will settle themselves, things will sort out themselves. It did not happen. And one of the examples of that, a very vivid example, is the election of Donald Trump. The kind of disaffection which existed among the rural America, particularly a large number of jobs which are lost, led to this. And therefore, whatever Trump did by raising tariffs, etc., won him a lot of popular support. And if you look at the results of the US presidential election, there was hardly 0.5% difference in the popular vote between Trump and Biden. So that only goes to show that disaffection remains very high, and people do believe that Trump was his savior.
Well,
so winners and losers.
Exactly. So you did say that the problem is that, well, yes, liberalization creates winners and losers, and you identified government's limited capacity to assist or help the losers adjust to a new reality, if I understood you correctly. Now,
Correct.
That is to governments at the national level. And in my various previous incarnations, I've been discussing this with experts from academia, intergovernmental processes. And what you just said is frequently put on the table as a main reason for the problem, the lack of capacity for governments at the national level. That is most likely very true. However, if I may to say that there might also be a need for an improvement in the capacity and quality, perhaps even more so, at the governance at the global level, meaning a greater coherence between the various instruments of global economic governance, including the WTO, so that trade policy, facilitation of market opening, predictability for trade and investment is done in such a way as also to take into account other objectives in government, namely at the global level as well, environmental concerns, human rights concerns, labor standards issues, to the extent they are impacted by trade and investment. Do you subscribe to that?
Yeah, yes and no. I mean, in the sense that let me turn your attention to another very important international instrument which addresses a very large number of issues, is the Sustainable Development Goals.
Exactly.
The Agenda for Sustainable Development Goals 2030.
Yeah.
It's so comprehensive that it addresses most of these issues in one manner or the other.
Right. I agree.
And the,
I agree.
And the very critical core of that particular agenda is leave no one behind. The moment you talk about leaving no one behind is that you ensure that nobody is deprived or disadvantaged in the system that he or she is living in. And that would mean that all kinds of agreements, whether it's global governance or national governance, have to find ways as to how to see to it that as Gandhi said, whenever you take a decision, put the poorest man's face in front of you, and then think whether this decision will help a poor man or poor woman.
Right.
As such.
And on
that is the kind of thing what I see is the talisman for leave no one behind.
I agree. On the issue of poverty reduction, there is no question, I think, that there's no doubt that market access for developing countries, including India, of course, is important to increase economic efficiency and therefore the resources available to address poverty. There's little question about it. Now, the issue is, I suppose, that the market efficiency obtained by liberalizing trade, as you said earlier, creates not only winners but losers. Now, what is one reason for that might be that the rules of the game do not take into account production process. The key nexus, the sort of centerpiece of the beautiful architecture created by the World Trade Organization, namely non-discrimination of like products. That's fundamentally the key to the current trading regime in the WTO framework. Now, that criterion of non-discrimination and national treatment of like products does not, to a great extent, look into the production process. Therefore, a white T-shirt from country X and a white T-shirt from country Y are considered like products, regardless of how they are produced, with very minor exceptions. Now, if that is indeed the case, wouldn't an investor and a producer and a trader, everything else being equal, wouldn't that individual or that company have an incentive to cut corners in terms of externalities, not taking into account externalities, and on that basis become competitive on price?
Thoralf, this is an issue which we've been debating for ever since the WTO, even before the WTO came into being. I'm talking about 1990s, the Uruguay round discussions. Exactly. Many of these issues were raised there, including at Marrakesh.
Yeah.
At Marrakesh, also, when the agreement was signed in April 1994, the WTO agreement, and a demand was made by some developed countries that trade and environment should also be on the agenda. And it was then booted out. They said, you cannot have non-trade issues to contaminate the agenda. Now, let me go back to the point which I made earlier about the SDGs agenda. One of the issues there, one of the important goals there is sustainable production and consumption. So exactly. if you can achieve those objectives through more sort of benign means rather than to use it as sanctions, this is what the developing world is scared of, because often developed countries, rich countries, have misused agreements to impose sanctions because it did not suit them. You heard of that? If you remember the famous dolphin tuna case, it was an important case. The decision was taken against the US for the simple reason that they were discriminatory. They did not include Ecuador in the same thing because they had a political issue. Right, like product. No, I mean, you can go on and on. So there is clear evidence of skullduggery in many of these issues, and therefore the developing countries have been very shy, have been opposing any non-trade issues to contaminate the trade agenda. So when you talk in terms of production process, etc., what I'm saying is these are equally important for us, but don't mix it with trade.
No, we've had this conversation, you and I.
We've had it many times, and we'll continue to hold that position and argue about it in the most logical manner. And as I said, there is another channel which is available to us to push that agenda, which is the SDGs to 2030. I think it's goal 12 or goal 17.
I really
talks about sustainable production and consumption. Yeah. The moment you look at SPAC, then Norway. Between India and Norway, we have, in fact, done a lot of work on SPAC with the Norwegian government support.
Absolutely.
Norway, if you remember the very famous Oslo Declaration on sustainable production and consumption, and that became the sort of basis for a global discussion. So let's not forget that there are soft means to achieve the same goals.
That's basically where I'm getting at, because first of all, I appreciate and I thank you for bringing the attention of our viewers to the 2030 agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals. After all, one of the pillars of the Modern India, the think tank we are now talking, whose platform we're now talking on, is sustainability. Now, the SDGs are a comprehensive package. Then you have, in particular, SDG 8, which deals with economic growth and decent work. And you have another SDG on the environment, and so forth. Now, we do both realize with our experience that this issue of definition of light products and what is considered trade relevant or non-trade issues is somewhat controversial. It's been going on for years, if not to say decades. Now, one way of moving forward outside the WTO, but also within the WTO, might be, and I'm just tossing this up as a suggestion for reflection, to expand the current or the established Committee on Trade and Environment, which has been around since the beginning. And in light of the heads of state decisions in 2015 to establish the 2030 Agenda and the Sustainable Development Goals, perhaps time has come for the WTO community, the same governments, by the way, to adopt and to reform and lightweight reform of procedure to facilitate a more open-minded discussion of trade and sustainable development by changing the name and the mandate of the the Committee on Trade and Environment to the Committee on Trade and Sustainable Development. What do you think of such an idea?
Thoralf, I think a lot of you are ignoramuses. Do you know what sustainable development means?
Yes.
What?
Yes, of course.
Please tell me.
I was, in fact, I was part of the negotiations behind the SDGs. Sustainable development is development on the basis of without jeopardizing future capacities. Now, you have three corners of the sustainable development concept: ecological, economic, and social. They are equally important and considered to be mutually reinforcing. So they are interconnected, and we need to treat them as such. In other words, back to the issue of coherence, you cannot produce economic growth at the expense of the environment for too long. That is not. And
you cannot protect the environment at the cost of the economic growth.
Exactly.
Because you still have to fill stomachs.
The challenge is to make them mutually reinforcing.
Exactly. You know, you've seen the Venn diagram.
Yes.
Where sustainable development comes in between ecology, equity, and environment.
Exactly.
And the tragedy is that many people in the West continue to argue, like you did, that sustainable development means environment. No, it does not, sir.
No. I didn't say that. I didn't say
and
that.
And that is why, if you look at the entire gamut of sustainable development goals agenda, it does not talk only about environment. It talks about jobs. It talks about economic security, which is today. Now, we all know there are various examples.
I completely agree.
Yeah, so please let me disabuse you again and carry this message that sustainable development doesn't mean environment. It includes environment, but is not limited to environment, and that is where
that's precisely my point.
The Western academics and government delegates completely, continue to talk in this very blinkered manner that sustainable development.
I think you may have misunderstood me. My purpose.
I'm coming back to my point which I made earlier, that let us look at the SDGs agenda, which is very, very comprehensive. It touches anything and everything which impacts a human being.
Yeah, my point is,
and as I said, when you said leave no one behind, it also includes human beings as well as non-human beings on this earth.
Yes. So, Pradeep, my question is, how do we make sure that the trade rules as defined by the World Trade Organization, which, by the way, is a member state-driven organization, so it's basically governments who come together and collectively agree on rules of the game. How do we make sure that the rules embedded in the WTO rulebook for the future takes into account the concept of sustainable development in all its three dimensions: economic growth, social, and ecological sustainability?
The preamble of the WTO talks about sustainable development.
Yeah, the preamble does, but when push comes down to shove, the current interpretation of the operational paragraphs in the agreement does not seem to prevent investors, traders, and producers to operate in such a way as to compromise on social and ecological aspects of sustainable development. that is the perception among many, including the people who voted Donald Trump into the White House. I think it's fairly a broad consensus that this has been the frustration of the rules of the game has been one component in explaining the backlash against globalization as embedded and
Thoralf, let me remind you about one gross inanity or gross sort of inequity in the WTO system is the issue about special and differential treatment.
Exactly. That's a very good reminder.
The Western countries, the developed countries, were given special and differential treatment in two areas which are all enforceable. The developing world has been given special and differential treatment as best endeavor. And I still remember in Doha there were three declarations. One was an implementation issue which did not move anywhere at all. And that dealt with this issue of special and differential treatment. When I talk about the kind of inequity which existed was that agriculture, for example.
Yes.
The West still enjoys enforceable special and differential treatment. Textiles is over.
Yeah.
The agreement is expired. There was a self-expiring.
For the sake of our viewers who are not
and
experts.
In 1 minute, the agreement on textiles and clothing had this 10-year sort of exhaustion of the quota regime which existed. Right. And the same losers of those jobs in the rich countries did cry about it. The fact is that, you can get garments cheaper from Bangladesh and Guatemala or wherever rather than to make it in Norway.
Can I just, for the sake of the people watching this,
on agriculture, for example. Now, why, something, the dirty subsidies in the West has already destroyed the agriculture in a very large number of developing countries. Right. Look at the dirty cotton subsidies. The poor West African nations are still suffering from the US.
So I hear from what you're saying.
So you want to bring in rules, 1 minute, you want to bring in rules for a heterogeneous world. And a heterogeneous world where there is inherent inequity.
I don't want anything, frankly. Personally, I don't want anything. And whatever I want is not really relevant in this context. I'm just raising questions that are out there among participants in the debate and those who are behind the policy making at the country level, which come together in Geneva and elsewhere. So that being said, I think we need to explain to the viewers what special and differential treatment is. It is, in short, developing countries in general, least developed countries in particular, have greater flexibility with regard to state intervention in the market. Isn't that right?
Yeah.
In principle. Now, then, of course, the ability to benefit from that depends on a number of factors, including financial capacity and so forth, which means that very often this may be a paper tiger. It's a liberty, a flexibility that's in principle and formally speaking available, but in practice not so easy to utilize. Is that right?
No, I know, but
that's one.
Some of the things which do function is the longer time period for LDCs to honor the commitments made under the WTO agreements. But that is of hardly any respite.
No, but one thing is the LDCs, but one issue behind the frustration among many about the current situation is that huge developing countries benefit from greater flexibility in terms of state intervention, including agricultural subsidies, by the way, meaning that they have an advantage vis-a-vis developed countries who do not have this privilege of special and differential treatment. And of course, I think you know which country in particular I'm referring to, namely your neighbor to the northeast, who joined the WTO in 2001. The process I was fortunate enough to take part in. And in fact, this very issue was something I was personally very much involved in. Now, is this a fair assumption that the flexibility available to large and very productive and competitive countries who still qualify as developing countries by all means, but the flexibility at their disposal may give them an advantage, a competitive advantage, which may have unfortunate repercussions.
I agree with you that particularly if you're talking about our dear neighbor China, which is not in the best of friends today with India for
I
several
understand
reasons. For several reasons,
that. Yeah.
uh, have been using state-owned enterprises, including state subsidies to their own manufacturing in order to become competitive. Unfortunately, the regimes on these kind of support or subsidies in the WTO are very weak. And that is the reason why the US has been, saying that, that China has been unfairly using WTO, which is right. I agree with the US stand that China has used its. In fact, for China, it was a win-win situation. It could enter the international market through subsidized means on a very competitive basis. And second is to lock in their domestic reforms.
Right.
That is one of the reasons why they wanted to join the WTO.
That's actually very often an incentive for many countries, including.
No, I mean, one can admire China for doing that, in the sense that, whatever they've done it well for their own country, etc., etc. Right. Whether it was fair or unfair is another point. Apparently, it is unfair.
Yes. So, given, let's agree on this, that we do agree that there is a real challenge with regard to the real and perceived difference in privilege for some countries and less for other countries. Now, if that is indeed the case, and we have seen in North America, in the US in particular, but also in Western Europe, an increasing frustration among working class and lower middle class people, making them indifferent to or outright in opposition to further liberalization and a rejection of globalization. Now, I think you and me and most of the people we work with and deal with agree that it would be irrational and very unfortunate to reverse market openings, global integration. Now, if that is so obvious to all the experts, but not so obvious to the general public, whatever you and I think, we have a political challenge. And how do we go about dealing with that? Is it sufficient to deal with it at the national level, or is it also necessary to have a more open-minded, genuine engagement on these issues at the global level, including at the WTO?
I think both are necessary. You cannot escape from the fact is that your sovereignty has anyway been multilateralized.
Exactly.
By joining WTO and the various agreements, there are a lot of issues, your standards, etc., decided elsewhere and not by your parliament.
Very good. Thank you, Pradeep. I would like on this to follow up a little bit.
Now, which is fair enough. But let me point out that there would be losers in the system, come what may, and that is the reason why I said let us try and use the SDGs agenda in a way to counter the negativities which arise from globalization.
Precisely. I can agree.
Even the SDG agenda does not denounce globalization. It doesn't say that globalization is bad.
On the contrary. On the
contrary, as I said, in India itself, we've seen globalization has been helpful. Let me go back to China, Thoralf. There's one very, very important point to make in the current context. The world's largest trading bloc, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, has been signed on this last Sunday. India has opted to stay out of it because of the China factor.
I was going to ask you about it.
Exactly, because of the China factor. So we don't know. And on the 9th of December, we are doing a webinar on this between the pros and cons of the India joining or not joining RCEP. We feel it will be helpful for India, particularly, to join this, as otherwise, there will be a lot of trade diversion which will take place.
Yes, and in fact, you were part of the negotiations for a long time, and it's only relatively recently that you opted out, isn't that right? What was the reason? You said China was the reason.
We've been in negotiation from beginning to nearly the last 2 meetings ago. The one meeting in Bangkok where our Prime Minister went and publicly announced that they're not going to join. See, the problem was that China was not ready to give in anywhere that we wanted them to do, which is like, circuit breaker for import surges and so on and so forth. And rules of origin. There are two important issues that China was very clever about it. Now, let us see how what the government has done as a fallback is to strengthen our bilateral trade agreements with the members of the FTA, with the members of the RCEP. We already have agreements with Japan, Korea, and ASEAN, and including with Thailand and Malaysia and underneath. The only thing which is pending is Australia and New Zealand, which we are going to sign a separate agreement with them, so that we don't lose our market to RCEP memberships.
I was going to ask you about the perception of, from in Delhi in particular, I mean, among Indian policymakers, yourself included, although you're not a member of government, you're very close to a number of individuals and institutions who take important decisions. So with your insight, would India be, in light of also RCEP and other developments, would India be keen to revitalize the WTO? Because in as much as you have regional developments here and there, nothing can substitute for the World Trade Organization as a global, well, is that right?
Our commitment and faith and confidence in a multilateral system still remains very high. And we'll continue to work with all countries, including Norway, to ensure the multilateralism survives, which includes WTO, WHO, etc., etc. And we also hope that the new administration in the US will be supportive of this effort. Joe Biden has said it publicly.
Very good, very good. I think Norway and India share many fundamental characteristics, although we are different. One of them being, of course, democracy, the belief in the rule of law, market opening, and deepening of global integration for the sake of not only the few and privileged, but for the many. Poor in particular, but also for those in the middle income range who tend to be politically decisive in most countries, and in particular perhaps currently in Europe and North America. We need to make sure that the general public in all countries are seen to be, and they feel themselves benefiting from further globalization based on predictable rules of the game. Do you agree with that?
I agree with that, and as I said, and I implore you that let us try to use the SDG agenda as much as we can to put countries on the sort of test of how the SDG goals are being implemented.
Right. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.